Okay, so get this. We're diving into the world of trillions today. Like, seriously, trillions. The kind of money needed to wrap our heads around climate change and actually do something about it. You know?
It's about time we had this conversation, right?
Right. It's mind-boggling, the scale of it all. And the really wild part is that India is stepping up, trying to bring some clarity to how these trillions actually get put to use.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about climate finance, but India is actually putting its money where its mouth is. They've just launched a new framework for how financial institutions should be disclosing climate-related risks.
Which is huge E.
Yeah.
And we've got two really interesting articles here that dig into why this is such a big deal. So two articles, one deep dive. Our mission, dear listener, is to break down why this framework matters, how it fits into what's happening globally, and what kind of impact it could have.
Because, let's be real, what happens in India's financial system? It doesn't just stay in India. This has ripple effects on sustainable investing all over the world.
Exactly. So no pressure, India.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first article really jumps into the nitty-gritty of the framework itself. It highlights these four main pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets.
Hmm.
And I have to admit, my eyes kind of glazed over at first, you know?
Right.
Like, oh, great, more jargon.
Yeah.
But then I started thinking about the sheer scale of what we're talking about here.
It's not just about checking boxes, right?
Mm.
These pillars, they're meant to fundamentally change how financial institutions think about risk in a world where climate change is the defining challenge.
It's like the old playbook just doesn't cut it anymore.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get specific. Say a bank is considering a major loan, right? How do these pillars actually play out in that scenario?
Okay, so imagine a big energy company needs capital, right? They could build another coal plant, which might look good on paper in the short term, or they could take that investment and pour it into renewable energy.
Which, let's be honest, is the riskier move, at least traditionally, right?
It used to be, but not so much anymore, and that's the whole point of this framework.
So how does that play out in our bank loan example?
Well, the bank can't just look at the immediate profits anymore.
They have to consider the bigger picture of climate risk.
Exactly. And this is where that strategy pillar gets really interesting. Let's say this bank, they've got a history of lending to, say, fossil fuel companies.
Which has always been seen as a safe bet.
Right, but with these new disclosure rules, investors can suddenly see that this bank, they might be super exposed if stricter emissions regulations come into play.
Or if, God forbid, the price of oil skyrockets and those fossil fuel investments go belly up.
Precisely. Or if there's a much faster than expected shift towards renewables, it's like shining a giant spotlight on their potential vulnerabilities.
Which, as an investor, would make you think twice. Or you'd be looking for those climate-smart options instead.
Exactly. And that's just one example. We've got four pillars here covering everything from how these financial institutions are governed to how they actually measure and report their climate impact.
And it's all benchmarked against global standards, right? This isn't just India going rogue and doing its own thing.
Right. They're aligning with groups like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD for short. They're trying to create a common language for how companies and financial institutions disclose this stuff.
So India's taking those international best practices and, I imagine, tailoring them to their own context.
Exactly. Because India has its own unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to climate change and economic development.
For sure. Okay, so we've got these four pillars. We've got this idea that India is trying to create a more transparent and accountable financial system.
Yeah.
But how does it actually work in practice? Like, what are the nuts and bolts of these disclosures?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and I think it's worth unpacking each of these pillars in a bit more detail, because as they say, the devil's in the details. It is.
Okay, so details it is. Let's peel back the layers of these pillars, starting with governance, because I mean, isn't that the foundation of, well, pretty much everything?
It really is. I mean, you could have like the most ambitious climate goals in the world, right? But without the right governance structures in place, it's all just, words on paper, empty promises.
Yeah, it's like having a great blueprint, but no one to actually build the house.
Exactly.
So in the context of this framework, what does good governance actually look like?
So this pillar, it's all about transparency, right? Financial institutions have to be really upfront about who's making the decisions about climate-related risks and how they're integrating those considerations into their overall business strategy. It's about accountability, making sure someone's at the helm, steering the ship in the right direction.
So it's not just about like having a committee dedicated to climate change or something.
Right, right. It's not just about ticking a box. It's about demonstrating that climate risk is woven into the very fabric of how these institutions operate.
Okay, so it's about embedding climate consciousness into the DNA of these institutions.
Exactly. And it's not just about the who, it's about the how. Financial institutions, they need to be able to demonstrate that they have a robust, step-by-step process for actually identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks. They can't just pay lip service to it. They have to live it.
Okay, that makes total sense. So we've got this foundation of governance, but now let's move on to strategy, because this feels like where things could get really interesting, especially for companies that maybe have been dragging their feet on climate action. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. This is where the rubber meets the road. This pillar really separates the talkers from the doers. It's no longer enough to have this vague commitment to sustainability or, a few green initiatives here and there. Financial institutions need to show concretely how their entire business model will actually hold up in a world that's being reshaped by climate change.
So they can't just rely on, like, outdated assumptions about what the future holds.
Yeah.
They have to really think through those different scenarios we talked about earlier, like what happens if there are stricter emissions regulations, or if the cost of fossil fuels goes through the roof.
Right, and this is where we often see a huge gap between what companies say and what they actually do. This pillar is all about closing that gap by requiring them to, show their work.
No more hiding behind vague promises or greenwashing. They actually have to lay out a plan, like a real concrete plan for how they'll manage these risks.
Exactly. And the next pillar, risk management, takes all of this a step further. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty.
Okay, so walk us through it.
So we're talking about actually identifying, measuring, and disclosing the specific climate-related risks that they face. And this is important. It goes beyond just the traditional financial risks.
Well, it's not just about whether a company can repay a loan, but whether that loan makes sense in a world where, like, wildfires are more frequent or sea levels are rising.
Exactly. We're talking about the physical risks, like, damage to assets from extreme weather events, but also, like we were talking about earlier, those transition risks.
Right. Those risks that come with shifting to a low-carbon economy.
Yes. Like if a company has all of their money invested in fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's a transition risk just waiting to blow up.
Exactly. And under this framework, they would have to be upfront about that. They would have to try to actually quantify those risks as much as they can and disclose how they're managing them.
Okay, so it's about understanding the full spectrum of risk. Not just the financial bottom line, but the environmental and social bottom line as well.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these pieces all fit together. But what about the last pillar? Metrics and targets. This one sounds, I don't know, maybe the most action-oriented.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
This is where the rubber really meets the road, where those aspirations turn into actual measurable action. Financial institutions need to set clear targets for how they're going to reduce their own environmental impact.
So it's not just about managing risk anymore. It's about actually driving positive change.
Yeah.
But how do they even begin to measure something as complex as, like, their overall climate impact?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's where things get a bit tricky. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. The framework encourages these institutions to use established methodologies and really align with international standards whenever possible.
So there's some flexibility, but also a push towards using data that's credible and, importantly, comparable. Okay, but let's talk about the elephant in the room, enforcement. Is this framework all bark and no bite? Like, are there actual consequences if these institutions don't comply?
That's the question, isn't it? And the answer, well, it's complicated. The RBI, India's central bank, they're taking this really interesting kind of phased approach.
So they're not just, like, dropping the hammer all at once.
Exactly.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
So they're starting with these mandatory kind of baseline disclosures. Those are for every financial institution that's covered by this framework.
So that's like the bare minimum everyone has to do, right?
Exactly. But, and this is the fascinating part, they're making the more detailed disclosures, what they're calling enhanced disclosures. Those are under that metrics and targets pillar, and those are actually voluntary, at least for now.
Voluntary.
Yeah.
That's a bold move. It almost seems like they're trying to incentivize transparency rather than, like, forcing it,
It's a really fascinating strategy, right? Because by making those enhanced disclosures optional, they're basically creating a system where the institutions that are really going above and beyond, they can differentiate themselves.
So it's like a badge of honor. Look at us. We're not just complying with the bare minimum, we're going above and beyond because we're serious about sustainability.
Exactly. And investors are paying attention, right? Those who are choosing to disclose more, they're going to be seen as less risky, potentially attracting more investors, even getting better loan
Right,
terms.
because it shows they're not afraid of transparency.
Yeah,
They're not trying to hide anything. It's
exactly.
like they're putting it all out there.
Yeah, it's a clever way to encourage a race to the top, so to speak.
I like it. Okay, so we've really dissected this framework, but let's zoom out for a second. Because the second article we have here, it kind of takes a broader view. It delves into this whole concept of a just transition, which honestly, at first glance, it sounds like something out of a utopian novel or something.
I know, right?
But in the context of climate change, especially in a place like India, it, it takes on this whole other meaning, don't you think?
It absolutely does.
So for our listeners who might be hearing this term for the first time, can you break down what a just transition actually means in the real world?
Yeah, so remember how we were talking about how tackling climate change isn't just about reducing emissions? It's about making sure that that transition happens in a way that's fair and equitable for everyone, especially those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and really importantly, those whose livelihoods are tied to industries that are, let's be honest, not sustainable in a low-carbon world.
So it's about making sure that the people who are least responsible for climate change aren't the ones who get left holding the bag, so to speak.
Exactly, exactly.
And this is where India's new framework comes in, right?
Hmm.
It's not just about shifting financial flows.
Hmm.
It's about creating a system that supports a just transition by making those risks and opportunities crystal clear.
Yes, and this is where things get really, really interesting.
Yeah.
It really is. It's about, like you said, connecting those dots between, climate action, economic development, social justice. It's about making sure no one gets left behind.
Right, because we can't just like flip a switch and suddenly everyone's living in a solar-powered utopia, right?
Exactly. There are real people, real communities whose lives are intertwined with these industries that are, well, let's face it, on their way out.
So we're talking about a massive shift in thinking here. But what does a just transition actually look like on the ground, especially in a place like India, where, millions of people still rely on industries that are, frankly, incompatible with a climate-safe future?
Right. It's a huge challenge, no question. And the article actually uses the example of those coal-dependent regions in India.
Which, for a long time, those were the economic engines of the country, right?
Exactly. These communities powered India's growth for decades, but now they're facing a very uncertain future. A just transition means, investing in those regions, creating new job opportunities, and making sure that those workers, the ones who built India's energy infrastructure, they're not left behind.
Right, because we can't just, abandon these communities that have powered our economies for so long.
Exactly. And that's where the transparency piece of all of this comes in, right? Because these regions, they face a real uphill battle when it comes to attracting investment, right?
Yeah, because if investors are worried about climate risk, wouldn't they just shy away from places that are so reliant on fossil fuels?
That's the risk. But here's the thing. By requiring financial institutions to disclose those climate-related risks, India is actually creating a more level playing field. Investors can start to see the difference between those companies that are clinging to these outdated
Right,
models.
the ones who are just kind of burying their heads in the sand and hoping for the best.
Exactly. And those companies that are actually actively investing in a just transition.
The ones that see the writing on the wall.
Exactly. So it's like sending a signal to the market. If you're serious about a sustainable future in India, here's where to put your money.
Okay, so it's almost like by forcing companies to be more transparent, India is actually creating an incentive for them to invest in a just transition.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. The article argues that this transparency could actually unlock new sources of capital for developing countries in general.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about redirecting existing flows of money, it's about tapping into entirely new pools of capital.
Precisely. Think about all the investors out there, like the pension funds, the impact investors, even everyday people who are looking for ways to, put their money where their values are.
Right. And they're not just looking for a feel-good story. They want to see real impact, right? Like, show me the receipts.
Exactly. And that's what this framework offers. It's a way to connect the dots between climate action, social justice, and yes, financial returns.
Okay, I'm convinced this is huge, but we've covered a lot of ground here, from those super detailed ins and outs of India's framework to this broader vision of a just transition. For our listeners who might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now, what's the one big takeaway you want them to remember?
I think it's this. What's happening in India's financial sector right now, it's a really big deal. It's not just about India. It's a sign that the world is finally starting to wake up to how interconnected all of these issues are. Climate change, economic development, social justice, they're not separate boxes anymore.
Right, it's all part of the same puzzle.
Exactly. And the only way we're going to solve this puzzle, the only way we're going to create a truly just and sustainable future for everyone is if we shine a light on these systems, if we demand transparency.
Because you can't manage what you can't measure.
Right. Precisely. And as investors, as consumers, as citizens, we actually have a lot more power than we think. By demanding transparency, by supporting the companies, the institutions, the policymakers who are actually leading the charge, we can make a difference.
That's such an important message. We all have a role to play in this.
We do.
And on that note, for our listeners who want to dive even deeper into this, here's something to think about. If India's framework is successful, could it become a model for other countries? Could this be the thing that finally tips the scales and shifts global finance towards a more sustainable and equitable path? We'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time.